Now more than ever, innovative technologies are fueling change and sparking new ways of thinking. Collaboration between corporations and startups is key to staying at the forefront of these trends. However, finding the right startups can be expensive, time-consuming, and ineffective. But Plug and Play is here to help. As a corporate partner, you will gain access to a whole ecosystem of innovation. Discover startups that meet your tech interests. Stay updated on the latest trends and network with industry peers. We will help you during every stage of your innovation journey, no matter where you are and where you want to go. Get in touch today.
I'm trying to get my camera to work in a remote environment. Still haven't picked it up yet. Hi, everyone. I'm glad you could all make it out to the webinar today. The agenda for today's webinar is to essentially walk you through a brief presentation around adopting ESG practices. And we'll end the session with a Q&A. So before we kick the presentation off, next slide, I'd like to cover some quick housekeeping items. If you have any questions about the topic that we covered today, please submit your questions using the Q&A button at the bottom of your window. And for any general question or comments, please use the chat feature, which should be on the bottom right of your window. Next slide. And for those of you that do not know me, my name is Amit Patel. I'm a principal here at Plug and Play in the Ventures team, and I support our investments across enterprise tech, fintech, and insurtech. And much of kind of the topic that I'm going to cover today is a lot of the work that I've been essentially helping our partners with across the smart money health vertical in this vertical. And next slide. We have worked with many corporates across our ecosystem to support their ESG initiatives. And the purpose of today's presentation is to highlight startups that corporates can potentially work with depending on your respective ESG goals. Next slide. And there's been a growing support in recent years around the concept of stakeholder capitalism and a recognition of the importance of creating long-term value. Now, stakeholder capitalism is a philosophy based on the belief that companies have an obligation that goes beyond simply providing return to shareholders. It suggests that companies should be mindful of and responsive to their impact on society and the environment. Now, this can involve many things, from creating secure jobs for employees, embracing sustainable practices, paying fair taxes, to working to minimize the environmental footprint from your operation. In fact, Larry Fink, who is the CEO of BlackRock, he publicly released a letter to CEOs earlier this year, where he emphasized that a company must create value for and be valued by its full range of stakeholders in order to deliver long-term value for its shareholders. Now, there is growing evidence that companies that take a long-term view, which stakeholder capitalism requires, perform better. In a study, McKinsey found that those with a long-term view outperform the rest in earnings, revenue, investment, and job growth. They concluded that companies with strong environmental, social, and governance norms recorded higher performance and credit ratings through top-line growth, lower cost, fewer legal and regulatory interventions, higher productivity, and optimized investment and asset utilization. Not all stakeholders will be equally relevant for all companies, so it is important to decide where to start based on your company's business model and values. A financial services company with whom I work many with, they may choose to prioritize financial support because they have that expertise. And oil refinery, on the other hand, they may decide to prioritize operational impact and therefore choose to address the local environment, such as air quality and their respective emissions. Next slide. And so ESG initiatives, it should not just be viewed as a cost center, but I think they can truly be part of a broader business strategy to improve your bottom line. In fact, a meta-analysis by NYU found that financial performance was 70% more likely to be positive or at least neutral from the adoption of ESG initiatives. The researchers drew six conclusions or six key lessons from their work. And I want to draw your attention to three of them. The bullet number one, improved financial performance due to ESG becomes more noticeable over the long-term horizon. Bullet number four, companies' sustainability initiatives appear to drive better financial performance due to factors such as improved risk management and more innovation. And the last bullet, number six, ESG disclosures without an accompanying strategy does not drive financial performance. Next slide. There are many individual elements of ESG to consider. The environment criteria includes the energy your company takes in and the waste it discharges. Now, the environmental criteria encompasses carbon emissions and climate change. The social criteria addresses the relationships your company has and the reputation it fosters with people and institutions in the communities where you do business. It includes labor relations as well as diversity and inclusion. And finally, the governance is the internal systems of practices, controls, and procedures your company adopts in order to govern itself, making effective decisions and complying with laws. For today's presentation, our focus is mostly going to be on environmental and social criteria, but the governance will naturally be covered since they overlap with environmental and social, largely driven by regulation. So, under those two pillars, we're actually going to focus on decarbonization for the environmental pillar and diversity and inclusion for the social pillar of ESG. We are focusing on these two areas because we have seen the most amount of requests covering all or parts of these topics in the enterprise tech vertical. Of course, there are going to be areas that are going to be more relevant for certain industries, such as electric vehicles adoption and mobility, or carbon capture, utilization, and storage for industrial. The enterprise tech vertical and this webinar was intended to be industry agnostic. So I hope all the areas we cover today will be interesting and important for your company. To the next slide, and move on to the next slide. So let's go straight into it. On the decarbonization, there has never been a more pressing need for decarbonization. As illustrated in these figures, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, they underline that there has never been a more pressing need to kind of fight climate change. And human influence on global warming is undeniable. The IPCC report connects a dot between extreme events and long-term human causes. For example, sea levels are projected to increase depending on the warming between 1.5 feet to more than 3.5 feet by the end of the century. Entire countries like Bangladesh are meant to be, are expected to be completely in the water. And they're actually in the top 10 of the countries adversely impacted by climate change. And, climate change is an existential threat, not only for future generations, but for generations currently alive. If we don't act decisively now, it is estimated that 1/3 of the world's population will need to migrate for the next 50 years as their homelands become uninhabitable. The most important finding from the report is that there are still several possible futures. And there are reasons to be cautiously optimistic. For example, solar energy plus battery storage is now far cheaper than energy generated from coal, gas, and nuclear energy, and has been since 2019. Electric vehicles are gaining traction and could reach 60 to 70% of the market share by 2030, according to UBS. Consider that the market cap of Tesla is greater than Ford and General Motors combined, when Tesla sells less cars than each of them. People are actually betting an increase in electric vehicle adoption. And there's some regulatory tailwinds. The EU's announcement of the carbon border adjustment mechanism is essentially a carbon border tax, and it's the first real financial mechanism that can be used to punish climate laggards. Next slide. If you look at some of the most recent pledges in the last couple of years, more than 1/5 of the world's 2,000 largest companies have made net zero pledges, and 70% of the global economy is now committed to net zero. And most of these commitments were actually made over the last 2 years, between 2020 and 2021. Companies like Amazon, Starbucks, JetBlue, Microsoft, organizations like the Olympic Committee, the Football World Cup or Soccer World Cup for Americans, countries like Norway, US, cities like Austin, Texas, they've all made pledges to become carbon neutral over the coming years. Next slide. And within our ecosystem, we actually looked at, how many startups are coming up in the climate tech space. And so we examined over 600 startups working in the climate tech space in some shape or form since 2010, or actually since 2000, I should say. As you can see from this slide, it shows the cumulative number of startups in our ecosystem working on decarbonization. And we've really seen a boom in the number of startups working on climate via different technology adoption. Unsurprisingly, the graph illustrates that most of the startups operate in the data analytics space, as it's much easier to start a software company than deep tech hardware startups. But they are much more critical and important, and we are seeing kind of a much more uptick in the number of companies that are popping up to solve the space. I mean, we actually think the next $1 trillion company is going to be in the climate tech space, maybe even be Tesla. You've probably heard of the saying, you cannot manage what you cannot measure. And so this is reflective of the number of startups that we're seeing kind of in the data analytics space in our ecosystem. This is specifically true in the financial services industry, where banks are partnering with risk analytics companies or climate risk analytics startups to assess the impact of climate change on their portfolio, while insurers are using them to help underwrite risk. And we have seen huge amount of funding flowing into the climate tech space. In fact, climate tech funding reached 2.5 times pre-pandemic investment level in 2021, with over $37 billion of funding across coming from US and the European Union. The climate tech actually spaces we've seen around 47 unicorns since 2015, with 28 of them joining in 2021 alone. And they've collectively raised $50 billion at $130 billion in valuation. Next slide. And so within our ecosystem, the startups that we work with, we looked at, we broke down kind of the segment by different technologies. And again, this graph again shows rapid increase in the number of analytics or startups in the analytics and carbon marketplaces and offset space. This is because startups are answering the call of corporations, countries, and organizations to help them with their scope 1 and 2 carbon neutrality goals. It is also to help corporations truly understand where the carbon emissions are coming from and the true scope of these emissions. We're seeing some really exciting startups coming into different aspects of carbon neutrality, as shown in this slide. However, there are hard tech solutions that take longer to grow, but are mainly used for tackling scope 3 emissions. So depending on what your organization does, you will need a combination of solutions, both short-term and long-term, to be able to reach your goals. And a lot of the work that I've been doing, with some of our partners, in fact, primarily across fintech, we've been looking a lot at kind of using unique business models and even new products to solve climate change. Next slide. And so we have seen significant interest from our partners, industry agnostic, around essentially helping them monitor the carbon emissions and potential offsets. And so kind of that's what we're going to cover much throughout this section. So if you go to the next slide, carbon offsetting is posed to tackle a $700 billion opportunity. Now consider that only 0.5% of the annual global emissions are offset today. There are 2 markets for carbon offsets. In the compliance market, companies or governments buy carbon offsets in order to comply with caps on the total amount of carbon they're allowed to emit. In the voluntary market, individuals, companies, or governments purchase carbon offsets to mitigate their own emissions. It is entirely possible that large parts of the voluntary market will become mandatory. That is, the price of certain products will need to include the cost of such carbon offsets. And to give you an example, just about carbon offsetting, this is it's like an airline essentially investing in a carbon renewable project to offset of the from the gas that they emit from flying a plane. Now, the graph on the top right shows that the number of startups since 2015 has exploded as the demand for voluntary carbon credits has risen, mainly driven by the increasing commitments to reach net zero emissions. We analyzed around 54 startups covering carbon reporting and offsets and saw that the European Union is actually ahead of North America. This is not surprising considering much of the regulatory framework is being developed in the European Union and will be likely be emulated in North America. A very good example of this is, the GDPR, which was developed in the European Union, and now we're seeing much of it being emulated in North America. With the CCPA, California, New York developing their own regulations, and so we anticipate something similar around kind of climate kind of regulation. So next slide. In fact, there is a concerted international effort to align climate monitoring between corporates and states to improve carbon accounting, disclosure, and risk assessment. The G20 finance ministers and the central bank governors asked the Financial Stability Board, which was actually created after the 2008-2009 financial crisis to maintain financial stability. They asked the Financial Stability Board to review how the financial sector can take account of climate-related issues, which led to the creation of Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, aka or also known as TCFD. The TCFD's focus is reporting on the impact an organization has on the global climate. It seeks to make firms' climate-related disclosures more consistent and therefore more comparable. It believes that better information will allow companies to incorporate climate-related risk and opportunities into the risk management, strategic planning, and decision-making process. Now, this actually began as a voluntary set of recommendations, and it's now become part of the regulatory framework in many jurisdictions. The European Union, including France, UK, Switzerland, New Zealand, the Hong Kong Stock Exchange, they've all passed laws and rules mandating large companies make climate-related disclosures, some of them even using TCFD's recommendations as a framework. Other countries like Australia and the United States, they're likely going to be following this year. In fact, last month, the SEC proposed rule amendments that will require public companies to include certain climate-related information in their registration statements and periodic reports. The proposed rule will impose enhanced disclosure requirements on companies that have taken certain climate actions, including setting public goals or targets or adopting transition plans. The proposed rules, they're actually pegged against the 4 pillars of the TCFD. Next slide. So let's review some of the startups that can support the need for carbon accounting and reporting. Startups in this space are trying to do what the financial ERPs did for financial data decades ago, but this time to calculate and report carbon footprint. They want to make measuring and tracking every organization's carbon footprint as ubiquitous as managing the financial performance. So on the far right, platforms like Persephone, they automate the calculation, management, and reporting of carbon footprint data. Their cloud platform is able to ingest data from thousands of potential data sources, complete the required carbon calculations instantaneously, and provide results for disclosure and reporting purposes. We actually introduced them to one of the largest banks in Asia, SMBC, who ended up partnering with the startup and investing in the most recent 100 million Series B round. Next slide. Another startup, Watershed, it's a startup that's raised over 70 million from top-tier investors. They've built a platform kind of with 3 objectives. So they let companies measure their impact, develop plans in reducing those kind of emissions, and making reports on progress. They've worked with companies like Square. So Square is analyzing their Scope 3 emission, and it's meant to be looking at carbon intensity of their suppliers. In this case, Bitcoin miners. Square does not mine the cryptocurrency themselves, but they buy lots of it from miners. And so they've pledged $10 million to support cleaner initiatives for Bitcoin alongside a goal to hit net carbon, zero carbon by 2030. So Watershed has enabled Square to build a powerful and deeply specific climate action program, literally from scratch, where they can do carbon audits, they can implement strategic initiatives and provide investor grade reporting. They've also kind of worked with Shopify to actually assess how their workforce, suddenly all working from home, would change their emissions. And they also were able to analyze choices beyond their own, such as different shipping methods used by shops or stores on their platform. Next slide. So once you've figured out where where you stand when it comes to your carbon emissions, as I mentioned, reporting on its own is not going to do anything. There needs to be strategy involved. So carbon offsetting is one of them. So various marketplaces are emerging to help businesses and consumer assess and offset their carbon footprint, especially as these kind of net zero pledges have gone up. Startups like Pashima, which is backed by Bill Gates' venture fund Breakthrough Energy Ventures, they've built a marketplace where companies can support carbon offsetting projects through reforestation investments. Patch, which is a company that was in our program last year, they're building an API and integrations that connects with businesses to calculate their emissions and offset the carbon footprint by purchasing negative emissions from carbon removal projects. Next slide. Silvera is a very interesting company that's kind of in our ecosystem. Corporations can now use rating system, such as one that is being developed by Silvera, to identify, monitor, and report on the quality and performance of the offsets that they use to achieve the climate targets. The carbon offset marketplace is unregulated, and many offsets don't deliver on their climate promises. Now, Silvera is trying to boost transparency by assigning ratings to projects, similar to actually what the S&P Global Ratings and Moody's Investor Services do for debt issuances. The company has analyzed over 35 projects, and they found that nearly half of them don't deliver what they claim. At least 3 projects received the equivalent of a junk rating. And the company is using machine learning to analyze data such as satellite images to look at historical land use and assess how a project is performing against the benchmark set by its developers. Now, and Silvera makes their ratings and analysis available to the customers via an API. Many of the financial institutions partners that I'm working with, they're actually looking to work with Silvera to explore new products and business models in the decarbonization space. It's a very interesting company if you're actually looking to explore new products or business models for your own companies. Next slide. And I want to explore some of the initiatives that one of our banking partners, BNP Paribas, have taken up in collaboration with startups. They are the largest banking group in Europe and amongst the top 10 largest banks in the world. And I think they have, really demonstrated or been at the forefront when it comes to setting goals around sustainable finance and releasing new products and implementing new strategies to kind of hit those goals. And they've been exploring sustainable finance initiatives for over 5 years now. They actually adopted carbon neutral objectives on lending and investment activities. For example, they no longer fund tobacco, coal, fracking, or Arctic drilling, and they became the world's second largest player in the green bond market in 2020. They've also invested 250 million euros in startups mobilized for ecological transition. And they've also worked on kind of new products and business model. For example, they launched the first checking account that donated 1% of its revenue to climate nonprofits. So they teamed up with a startup called Doconomy from Europe to enable their customers to track and measure the impact of their purchases. The bank actually launched a 1% for the planet debit card, which essentially uses an API to track the carbon emissions of each transaction. This API is connected with Doconomy that provides an independent climate calculation to help consumers understand what the impact of the carbon footprint. And it connects each transaction to the impact that it has on the planet. They've also, BNP provides product to the institutional investors. One product is called Monoas, which enables institutional investors to store their fund data on a single platform in order to obtain a comprehensive and transparent view of their investments. They've partnered with startups like Clarity AI to assess the ESG risk and impact scores of the investments, their contributions to the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and climate change. And they were also working with Open Invest, which has now been acquired by JP Morgan, to help their clients to align their investment portfolio with the values. Next slide. And this page, they reflects a small portion of the climate tech market map that we've actually built at Plug and Play. You're not going to make a difference overnight, but partnering with some of these startups can help you achieve your decarbonization goals. Some of our corporate partners are working with a combination of these startups to launch new products, new business models, and just to help to hit their kind of the net zero carbon pledges. And this is particularly true for financial institutions. Next slide. And so for the second topic that I'd like to cover is diversity and inclusion. Next slide. Much of the work we have collaborated on with our partners has been around talent acquisition, management, including upskilling and reskilling, pay equity, and culture. So next slide. A McKinsey study found that earnings before interest and taxes increased by 8% for every 10% increase in the ethnic and gender composition of senior executive teams in the United States. Now, companies in the top quartile for gender diversity outperform their competitors by 21% in profitability and are 27% more likely to have a superior value creation. And the most ethnically diverse companies are 35% more likely to outperform the least ethnically diverse. Next slide. And so research shows that, if you want to help build diversity in the organization, and there is a lack of it right now, it's not a pipeline problem, but a product of outdated recruiting process. So companies have come to realize that the hiring tool that they've been using to simplify the process of recruiting, cultivating, and promoting talent weren't capturing the broadest and the most capable applicants. Several platforms have emerged to help companies tap into a diverse talent pool and assess them effectively. For example, Handshake, the first company on the left, they provide a platform for college-age students to register their interests and skills and search for suitable work, and for recruiters to search for candidates and advertise entry-level openings. The company has been around since 2014, and they really built their profile in part as a more inclusive kind of version of LinkedIn, aimed at people only starting out in the job market. They now cover 17 million job seekers. They work with 1,000 institutions of higher learning with partnerships with 120 minority-serving institutions, which includes historically Black colleges and university and Hispanic-serving institutions in the US, to help them and the students better tackle the job hunting market. The second company in the middle, Seek Out, they actually work with one of our corporate partners, Red Bull. Now, a study actually found by Talenia, they found that women and minorities tend to put 20 to 30% less skills on their profiles. And there are products out there that can help you predict and even add missing skills. So Seek Out, they've actually built out a database with hundreds of millions of profiles using their AI-powered talent search engine and deep interactive analytics. They find talents by scouring public data and use natural language and machine learning to understand the expertise of each candidate to build a complete 360-degree view of each potential employee. Specifically, they blend information from public profiles like GitHub, papers, patents, employee referrals, company alumni, and candidates in the applicant tracking system. So, while they're initially focused on technical talent, they've now since broadened their base to help recruiters and source and find more diverse candidates in general, as well as people with kind of simply hard to find skill sets. And they claim to do it with speed and precision via kind of a blind hiring method designed to reduce bias. And the third company on the right, Mom Project. Since the pandemic, federal data shows that men are entering the job market in droves. Women are not. From February 2020 to January 2022, male workers regained all jobs that they had lost due to the public health crisis. However, 1.1 million women left the labor force during that same time span, accounting for 63% of all jobs lost. And the statistics are even worse for women of color. While women gained 188,000 jobs just in January of 2022, they are still short by more than 1.8 million jobs lost since February 2020. Much of the reason cited for women leaving and remaining out of the workforce is due to childcare. Now, companies can partner with startups like the Mom Project to narrow this gap. They are a Chicago-based startup that focuses on connecting women, including parents, with jobs from organizations specifically open to employing people who meet that profile. The Mom Project is built around kind of a two-sided marketplace. On one side, the startup works with businesses to post job listings that specifically target women and those returning to work who might need more flexible terms in their employment engagement. On the other hand, it provides a platform to women who fit that basic profile, providing them both with job listings and other support. Now, beyond the Mom Project, we're seeing a flourishing of startups focusing on identifying and cultivating job opportunities for specific segment of the markets of specific talent pools, be it specific types of jobs like engineers with companies like Turing, or specific demographics such as a student demographic with companies like Ripple Match. We spoke about Handshake, in ways that the more general kind of platforms like those LinkedIn and Indeed, they don't highlight as well, or simply just cannot address. Next slide. And we covered diversity. While diversity is about differences, inclusion is about embracing those differences. Inclusion is about creating a workplace culture where all differences are welcomed, accepted, and appreciated. It refers to how people feel at work. A company's workforce may be diverse, but if the employee does not feel safe, welcomed, and valued, that company isn't inclusive and will not perform to its highest potential. The same McKinsey research that we looked at earlier, they showed that whilst overall sentiment on diversity was 52% positive, sentiment on inclusion was worse, way worse, at only 29% positive and 61% negative. So this actually demonstrates that hiring diverse talent isn't enough. It's the workplace experience that shapes whether people remain and thrive. If you look at the graph on the page, a BlackRock research found that a strong connection between employee sentiment and return potential driven by productivity enhancements. Next slide. And there are many ways to foster inclusion in the workplace, but let's look at one of them more closely: pay equity gap. What is meant by pay equity gap? It means equally compensating all employees who do the same work or similar duties, regardless of race, gender, disability, and other criteria. Wage equity accounts for tenure, experience, performance, but they seek to dismantle discrimination from the wage setting system. And unfortunately, it still remains pervasive in companies that claim to take action. This leads to lawsuits, underperformance, attrition, and frustration or a lack of transparency. Cultural movements of the past few years, including Black Lives Matters, Me Too, and Time's Up, shine light on these inequities and further demonstrate the need for companies to act with urgency. And wage equity isn't just a gender issue. Non-white workers in the US still receive lower wage than their white counterparts, with Black men having the largest uncontrolled pay gap relative to white men, earning 87 cents for every dollar a white man earned. A lack of pay equity is a problem that affects people with disabilities too. The Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits employees from discriminating against a qualified individual based on disability regarding employee compensation. Yet, research continues to show that earning gaps remain between employees with disabilities and those without. Now, there are 44 states in the US with individual pay equity laws. Most state laws go further than federal requirements, requiring employers to pay men and women equally for substantially similar work. Most mandate greater transparency in pay and put in place measures to protect employees who attempt to call out wage equity issues. And so there are, actually, we've seen numerous startups in this space to help address this gap. So the company on the left, Syndio. In fact, let's move on to the next slide. So Syndio is a startup that's developed kind of a pay equity gap analysis platform. One of our corporate partners, Willis Towers Watson, they're one of the biggest HR consulting shop in the world. They recognize pay equity gaps as a critical challenge for HR teams. Now, companies usually hire, a third party to do pay equity analysis reports. This process is expensive and can take several months. In the face of increasing regulatory scrutiny, disclosure requirements, and employee inquiries, Willis Towers Watson discovered that they needed to help their clients find an easy and efficient way to test for pay disparities. And they were actually looking to build a similar software in-house, but we introduced them to Syndio, and they ended up partnering up. Syndio's product analyzes salaries, rooting out discriminatory differences in pay that are tied to gender, race, ethnicity, or age, while providing strategies for fixing those disparities. They work with companies like Nordstrom, Salesforce, Slack, Adobe, and many others. Let's go into the next slide. As an extension kind of to the, or at least continuing our conversation around inclusion, people are more productive and creative when they have more positive emotions. And companies should work towards improving employee satisfaction and enhancing a positive and transparent workplace culture. Various startups can help companies assess their current state of culture and employee happiness and provide guidance how to improve them to achieve better performance. Culture Amp, for example, an Australian company, they allow corporates to survey their employees and then use the data to give companies an insight into how they can change their workplace culture, engage employees, and manage performance. They've actually, the Culture Amp, they've grown to encompass analytics for managers like turnover prediction and team goal tracking. They also have built a sizable online community where users can connect and book workshops, including ones run by diversity, equity, inclusion experts. And they're being used by more than 4,000 organizations, such as Salesforce, Unilever, PwC. BetterUp on the right, they are a company that connects employees with expert career and leadership development coaches online. They've actually proven that individual performance and organizational growth begins with company leadership taking a proactive and holistic approach to health, happiness, and resilience of the employees. And I definitely noticed kind of a major uptick in the number of companies looking at personal development and mental health actually issues for a lot of the employees. So we've worked with many of our partners in kind of helping them find relevant startups that they could potentially work with. Now I actually want to move on to a different topic. Let's go to the next slide. The other area where we have explored with our partners is around future work and automation. In the US, there are now 10 million fewer jobs than before the pandemic, and the unemployment is still well above its pre-COVID rate. At the same time, the proportion of lower skilled manual jobs has been shrinking for years. In fact, a McKinsey study finds, or at least estimates, that 1/4 of US jobs are at risk of automation. And they estimate that 4.9 million US workers will need new skills to remain employed in a digital economy. The World Economic Forum, they released their Future Jobs Report, which estimated that by 2025, 85 million jobs may be replaced by machines or algorithms, while 97 million new roles may emerge. Microsoft actually predicts that 149 million new jobs will be created by 2025, largely in technical fields like software development, cybersecurity, data roles, artificial intelligence. So, the report also estimates that companies are hoping to internally redeploy nearly 50% of workers displaced by technological automation augmentation, as opposed to making wider use of layoffs and automation-based kind of labor savings as a core workforce strategy. So next slide. So since the pandemic, we're seeing rapid adoption in automation and AI tech. AI is definitely transforming how companies operate and maintain a competitive advantage. In fact, in the third quarter of last year, nearly $18 billion was invested in AI companies, a record high. The need for AI in both consumer and enterprise domain is evident, but what this need has uncovered is an AI skills shortage, and it's large enough to become a barrier to AI adoption. Amongst firms surveyed by Gartner and the World Economic Forum, leading organizations have identified skills shortage as the biggest challenge or barrier to adoption of new technologies. LinkedIn actually notes that AI and machine learning specialist is the #1 emerging job in the US, followed by data scientists at #3. Moreover, machine learning engineers, deep learning engineers, algorithm developers, they're amongst the most sought after positions involving AI and ML skills. So, all of this demonstrates that upskilling, reskilling, it's not just beneficial for workers, but also for employers. A PwC study from 2020, they found that companies with the most advanced upskilling program saw 3 times the improvement in innovation. Next slide. So, and we've seen this in the market right now. Major employers have announced upskilling, reskilling initiatives. AT&T committed $1 billion in retraining half their workforce. Amazon pledged to spend over $700 million to reskill 100,000 employees by 2025 for in-demand tech jobs. JP Morgan pledged to invest $350 million to help their tech future workplace, help develop their future workplace skills. And Accenture is spending $1 billion in its reskilling initiatives. And several startups have emerged to support such initiatives. For example, the company on the left, Workera, they're building a comprehensive workforce measurement and upskilling solution with an initial focus on AI capabilities such as business analytics, data science, machine learning. And based on the assessment results, Workera automatically creates a customized learning pathway for an employee that identifies the best content for that specific learner, and they benchmark employees against others in the industry. So, and one of the startup's core value proposition is that they provide precision upskilling. Large organizations are subscribing to thousands of educational materials, and it seems like most of the people get assigned the same learning plan. Do you know what's the problem that is? It doesn't get completed because Workera. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to identify where the skills gap are, and they'll provide specific recommendation to upskill. So no 2 people on the same team will get the same learning plan. They'll actually get different learning recommendation, that's specifically identified by the skills level profile. And they don't actually provide the course content themselves. They will plug into your own learning management system to identify appropriate training materials. So they'll identify the best learning content that's out there for a specific skills gap, and they'll make it available, meaning they'll help you identify it. And companies are actually also using Workera to identify AI talent. The company has kind of deep ties to the deep learning community with over 1 million members from around the world. And so they've essentially tapped in that community, and they allow their customers to tap into that community to attract that talent. Skyhive, which is a company in the middle, they're actually one of our former batch companies from a few years ago, and they've grown substantially since then. They're more of a generalist platform and work with companies to support their general upskilling initiatives. They actually beat out some of the largest companies, including one of our own corporate partners, to work with the World Economic Forum on the labor analytics initiative. One of our banking partners, Deutsche Bank, also recently invested in this company. And the company on the right, Modal, they're actually led by former Udemy executives who helped scale the business from 1 million to 100 million in recurring revenue. Their aim at Modal is to provide cohort-based learning to enterprises. The startup's product focuses on increasing technical literacy with companies. They will group employees into 30 to 40 person groups before putting them into an 8-week learning experience, which includes asynchronous projects and live events. The founders are betting on the concept of curated cohort-based learning instead of asynchronous learning as a feature of how people comprehend information. It's interesting, actually, a couple of weeks ago, I was talking to one of our insurance partners, and I asked them, I said, do you actually participate in any learning initiatives in your organization, in that company? And outright he said, yeah, but I never finish it. And this is what Modal's trying to address. The challenge with a lot of the learning management that companies have adopted is that, frankly speaking, they're boring. You're assigned the same one to everyone. It's not very interactive. And so there's been a new kind of model around kind of live interactive training, which cohort-based learning provides. That's Modal is trying to emulate. Next slide. And so here is kind of a small section of the future of market map covering diversity and inclusion. Companies have the optionality to partner with various startups to support their respective diversity and inclusion initiatives. Next slide. And to kind of conclude this presentation, numerous studies reveal that ESG initiatives should not be seen purely as a cost center. And I think hopefully I've cited enough of them to convince you that, don't look at it just as a cost center. It can truly be part of your business strategy to help your companies outperform. We've seen some of our major kind of learnings from our partners has been, you need to take incremental steps. There is no magic bullet that's going to solve it overnight for any of your ESG goals, whatever that may be. Decarbonization and D&I is certainly the most popular one that I've kind of been working on with our partners. There's tons and tons of opportunities out there in terms of, at least for the short run, there's enough products and capabilities out there, companies out there, startups out there that your organization can potentially partner with to implement such goals. But I think the most important factor here is that you need to have long-term goals in mind. The whole idea of hitting quarterly targets, that's not going to work. If you want to survive and thrive in the long term, you need to have the long-term mentality, including when you think about adopting any ESG initiatives, because it has shown to pay off in the long run. Next slide. So I'd like to end the talk here and open up some time for Q&A. And for those that would like to work with any startups that I've mentioned here or want to explore the area further, feel free to reach out. If you are a startup in the ESG space and are not active in our ecosystem, please reach out as well. Our ecosystem is open to all startups, irrespective of size. It doesn't matter if you're bootstrapped or you've raised over 100 million. If you're working on something interesting and our partners are interested, we'd love to work with you and we'd love to connect you with them. So with that said, I'd like to open it up for Q&A. Let's see. So I have had questions come up. So one of the questions that I got was, who do you see typically leading ESG initiatives within an organization and what role? So the two, I can definitely talk about the two areas that I've covered today. Interestingly, when it comes to decarbonization, I've worked with actually different types of teams. I've worked with lending teams, or at least people who are trying to get into kind of the debt lending markets, such as green bonds. I've worked with business unit heads. So I've been working very closely with our banking partners as they're actually thinking about launching new products to target the climate conscious consumer, because they're seeing a lot of new opportunities. So it really, and innovation teams. Innovation teams are kind of the, are the group in the middle, and they're connected to different business units in the organization. So that's who I've been working with largely for their decarbonization initiatives. And for diversity and inclusion, it's largely been HR teams, actually. HR teams, and for upskilling, reskilling, besides HR teams, it's head of technology, head of research, head of data, any kind of high-level managers who are interested in upskilling or retraining the workforce, or developing their teams. It's who I've worked with. And then, so I got another question is how did your corporate partner recognize gaps? Can plug and play help benchmark DE&I needs? So, there is a saying here: you cannot manage what you cannot measure. And so there are companies that I mentioned in the presentation that essentially help you track of kind of all the your D&I metrics. There are tons of new startups that are coming out that help you track your D&I metrics. Now, what you do with them, that's entirely up to you. One very good example, Syndio is a very small subset of D&I. There are companies that kind of track broader ESG metrics, companies like Novisto, that I did not mention, but they can certainly provide that visibility. If you really want to look at like pay equity gap, companies like Navisto can actually help you identify where those gaps are. And then what you do with those results, that's obviously up to the organization and the teams. And these companies have, because of their work with several organizations, they've actually built out their own benchmark. So yes, you can definitely get access to this benchmark data. Another question that I got is, what can companies do to see where the gaps are in diversity and inclusion? I think this is quite similar to the previous question. Again, you can't manage what you cannot measure. There are tons of companies out there that can help you essentially measure your any kind of D&I metrics. Companies like Navisto do ESG, Persephone, Minimum, Emit-Wise. There's tons of companies out there that can help you track your carbon footprint around diversity and inclusion. There's Diverse, there is Syndio for pay equity. So tons of companies out there that can actually help you kind of see and assess kind of the reports. And we actually we also work with some of our consulting partners like EY. They've actually I know they have a database of their own metrics that they've kind of developed, and I'd be more than happy to connect you with them if that's of interest, if you're looking to get such data sets as well, or want to work with them. And I think that we've answered all the questions. So if you don't have any of the additional questions, thank you for tuning in. Hopefully you got something out of it. Oh, I did get a question, sorry. So I'll answer it for you. But for those of you that need to drop off, go for it. But the question is, are there any specific projects that are available that data and analytics startups can work? I don't think I understand this question. Are you asking if there are any initiatives that the startups can work on right now that are available? If you can put in the chat group or submit it again. Partner initiatives. Yes, there definitely are, which is why I highlighted some case studies of some of the initiatives that our partners are working on right now. I'm actually working with one of our HR teams at one of our insurance vertical as they've set their own kind of initiatives around talent recruitment, where DE&I or diversity and inclusion is an important metric that they're looking at. So we're actually helping them identify relevant startups that they can potentially work with. And this is ongoing. We get these sorts of requests throughout the year across our vertical. All right, if no other questions, please fill out the survey and feel free to reach out. Thank you.